When you see the runner in the stadium or the athlete on the field winning, who is on the final stretch, then he only wins because before he has already won another victory countless times, thousands of times, when no one was watching. Outward victory is one thing. That's what people can see. What success is, or where it comes to fullness, where someone fights and finally reaches the top. And the other thing is thousands of other little battles and small hidden victories that have to do with the inner person. And I have the impression that our life entrusts us with a series of inner battles and inner challenges where the goal is just to become strong, where the goal is to fight. And that's what I want to talk about today, because you all know this. People around you know it who urgently need a word of correction, but also of encouragement. And also in the Bible, there's hardly a single important person who never dealt with the enemy I want to talk about today.
Kaum einen großen Helden, kaum eine bedeutsame Persönlichkeit, die mit diesem Feind nichts zu tun hatte, von dem ich euch heute Abend berichten möchte.
Perhaps the most interesting person on that as a character, where you see it strongly, is Elijah. And what Elijah says, this phrase might seem familiar to one or the other among you. Namely, we read, Elijah goes into the desert. He went a day's journey into the desert. There he sat under a tree and wished to die. Okay. What do you want for Christmas? Death. He said, enough is enough. Lord, take my life, for I am no better than any of my forefathers. I don't know, you might not have said it so poetically, but maybe you know that feeling. You think, okay, it's all over now. Why am I still even alive? It would be better to just die. And also like, I'm no better than the others. I'm such a loser. And the voice that talks to you, this wave that overcomes him, I'll call it, or in general, it's called discouragement. Discouragement. So suddenly he's overwhelmed by a feeling that nothing makes sense anymore, and life itself has no purpose anymore. And he himself is nothing, totally bad, like that. And a few verses later he says, and that's interesting too, he says, with passionate zeal I was for the Lord, the God of armies, because Israel has left your covenant. I alone am left, and now they seek after my life. So nobody is left, nothing matters anymore, and my life is in danger. Do you know what's interesting? The interesting part of the story is, it comes right after the greatest victory Elijah ever had. And for those who aren't familiar with the story, the final is that there's a big showdown. There's the priest of Baal, and there's the priests of God. And both pray and say, whoever gets fire from heaven, theirs is the true God. And then fire falls on the sacrifice of Elijah, and all see that God is the only God. You'd think that's a full victory. Actually, it's the day of total triumph. But the puzzling thing is, one day later, hardly anything happens except the queen of the land, Jezebel. She says, hey, I'm going to kill you. And suddenly everything comes crashing down over him. He was strong, what a strong prophet he is, and it all crashes. Very interesting. Sometimes after your greatest success, you overdid it, and then a little thing happens and bam, suddenly it hits you like in an ambush. And the thing that hits you, I call it discouragement. And then he says this exact phrase, look here, I am the only one left. It's interesting, it's not true. Because just the day before, the whole people had proclaimed the Lord alone is God, and so it's not true at all. But somehow he loses perspective. It is as if he can't see clearly anymore. And this not seeing clearly, friends, is exactly what discouragement leads to. Discouragement makes it so you somehow don't have a clear perspective. I'll put that down here. perspective.
Perspektive. Also du hast keine
So you
klare
don't have perspective anymore,
Und was
and
er
what he can't see anymore is all his
eigentlich
past
seine
victories.
vergangenen Erfolge. Das ist eigentlich
It's
unglaublich.
actually incredible.
Tag
The day
zuvor
before he had his
ist der große
greatest
Erfolg.
victory.
Am nächsten
The
Tag
next day,
alles-
it's all
alles
useless. I'm about to
ähnliches,
die and I'm the
nichts,
only one
ich werde
left.
gleich sterben und ich bin der Einzige, der übrig ist. Das
So he
heißt, er
also
hat
doesn't have memory of it anymore.
mehr. Und all das
And all because of discouragement. Now, what is discouragement? It might sound a bit harmless, like, oh, anyone has a bad day sometimes. Paul compares our spiritual life with a battle. And he says, it's like you're wearing armor. And this armor and all that goes with it, helmet and such, each part has a different function. And then he says at one point, there is also a shield on the list. And then interesting, he says, with this shield you can ward off the fiery arrows of the enemy. The fiery arrows. So just for understanding, we're doing a bit of foundation research. Humans have a body. Most of you are aware of that. At the latest, when you get hungry. You can get attacked on a bodily level. If you hit someone, you will notice. Okay, but then most people also know that we also have emotions. Yes, someone can also attack you emotionally. It might not hurt physically, but he might hurt you emotionally. Okay, but then there's not just that, but humans are more. So animals also have emotions to a certain extent, and they also have a body. Humans are the only beings who can say that there's moral right and wrong, or who have a deep sense for God, that they ask questions like if there's life after death. And this dimension of a human we will now call spirit. One can look at humans, obviously they're a unit of body, emotion and spirit, but you can look at them based on their physical dimension. He is big, small, fat, skinny. About the emotional or soul dimension, does he have a temper or is he calm? And then there's also the spirit of a person. I'll draw it this way, like a triangle, okay? That's the body, the soul, and then there's the spirit. But some people don't even know that they have one of these. And you know what discouragement is? Discouragement is a fiery arrow, and it hits right here. It's interesting, a fiery arrow, this weapon, it causes something to start burning. And then smoke comes up, and everything is chaos. And an arrow is always something, should I say, aimed, okay? There are weapons without aim. You just hit something, but an arrow is targeted. And where does the archer aim his arrows? Of course, at the most vulnerable spot, a spot that's unprotected, and a spot that's important. You don't shoot into the bush where nothing important is hiding. You shoot towards something where you have an impact, where something happens. And you must know that there's something similar in the spiritual world. And the result of discouragement is like this here, okay? Discouragement has a clouding effect, specifically on your spirit. By the way, not only discouragement, but also sin. So when you do things that are just wrong, then you lose the ability to discern what is right and wrong. And you end up in a fog. A lot of people have this situation. But even if you're trying, I want to be a person who lives well and lives with Jesus and everything, discouragement can come and hit you like an arrow and cause a fog around you. It's like a cloud sets in where you can't see clearly anymore. Now don't misunderstand me, that doesn't make you more intelligent or less intelligent. The physically too. So it doesn't just make the body feel bad. That means these aren't people who are somehow disturbed in that way. But we still lose the ability to discern things in a spiritual way. That's why I really want to look at this topic of discouragement with you today, because I feel like discouragement, we pretend this all the time is normal. Everyone has a bad day sometimes, but that's not what I'm talking about. I had a bad day. Elijah, one day he's a hero of faith, and the next day he wants to die. That's something more. But what it also isn't is depression. So I'm not talking about someone being melancholic or depressed or in a depressive phase, which, by the way, many people experience and is partly a normal part of the human soul. But discouragement is something else. Discouragement is actually there's no outside reason for it. That's number one. Second, you're not usually the cowardly type, but suddenly feel it. So a working definition I might give is, discouragement is a sudden, irrational, and unspecific loss of perspective. Again, it's sudden, so you're not normally in this bad mood, but it's sudden and irrational. That means not much has changed on the outside, but suddenly it feels dark. And it's unspecific, so you can't even say what the problem is. You can't say for sure, hey, that's the reason because that guy was mean to me or something. No, it's unspecific, just shows up and you lose perspective. You have this impression what was so clear before is not clear anymore. And suddenly you're just reacting and in a cloud and barely even have a memory. What was it again that motivated me so much yesterday? And suddenly you feel so alone. You don't remember the other people who could help you. You feel like the last one standing and somehow don't have perspective anymore. That, my friend, is more than having a bad day. It's a deliberate attack on you. But we ought to overcome it. Every athlete knows this. 1,000 times. Every inventor knows this. Funny, even U2, probably the most famous rock band in the world now, the first record company they wrote to, like in 1979 or 80, they wrote back, sorry, you don't really have talent. There's just no room for you in the pop industry. Well, joke's on them. But every musician knows it, that they have to fight and expect resistance and discouragement. And the same applies to the spiritual dimension. Today I want to look at it with you specifically with a story. This story is about rebuilding Jerusalem. Quick history. The Neo-Babylonians ruled about 600 BC. They entered Jerusalem, destroyed everything, and took the majority of the local people to Babylon, modern-day Iraq and Iran area. And 70 years later, the first wave of Jews started to rebuild Jerusalem. That actually happened. You can see it in archaeological records. And one of the leading men who played an important role was Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was actually an official at the king's palace in Babel. And it's quite moving. He hears how the city is in rubble and ashes and that the gates are destroyed, and it moves him deeply. So he asks the king's permission to go there. And the king says, okay, you can go to Jerusalem and rebuild the city walls there again. And I even saw parts of the city walls of Nehemiah in original digging sites in Jerusalem. You can prove it historically. And Nehemiah goes, and it's interesting what happens next. I'll read the passage to you real quick. Nehemiah goes around the city and sees it's all ruined, all destroyed. And then he says to the inhabitants, hey, this can't stay like this. He says, but now, saying to them, you see for yourself what misery we live in. Jerusalem is in ruins and its gates are burnt down. Let's go and build the walls of Jerusalem up again and so end our shame. Then I reported to them how the hand of my God had been so gracious to me and what the king had said to me. And then they all said, yes, we want to get to work and build. And they took this good cause into their hands. Next sentence. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard of this, they despised us and said, what is this that you are doing? Do you want to rebel against the king? Very interesting. Sanballat the Horonite, Geshem the Arab, and Tobiah the servant of Ammon. Do you know who they are? No, me neither. So-and-so, Mr. Jones and Mr. Miller. No idea, never heard of them before. And it's interesting, here Jerusalem lies in ruins for 70 years and nobody cares. But then someone shows up and says, hey, let's rebuild the walls. And all of a sudden they come crawling out of their holes. You've never heard of them, but no matter who it is, we're against it. And that's interesting, because that's what happens. See here, the destroyed walls. And as long as everyone says it's a destroyed wall, nothing can change, there's no problem. But as soon as someone gets up and says, wait, that's the old city wall of Jerusalem, we should rebuild it, all of a sudden resistance comes calling. And that, friends, you need to understand. Anyone who sees the status quo, what's right now, and says it needs to change, they will feel resistance. Everyone. If you're a wallflower, you're one of many wallflowers. If you are a little ship, you float with the waves. Sorry, nobody will resist you there. But simply because, and we need to get this, simply because you want to change something, some people will hate you. They might not even have arguments coming from people you never heard of, Ammon and Geshem, or whatever they're called, come out of hiding. Kurt Tucholsky said it's not only true for Germans, but he said it about Germans. And if the German has nothing else, he will at least have one thing: objections. There's truth to that. But hence discouragement. It hits anyone who sees the status quo, and I don't mean the band, and wants to change it.
Sieht, nicht die Band meine ich, sondern das Status Quo sieht und ihn verändern will. Verändern will. So I'm saying that everyone who sees the status quo, the way things are now, and who wants to change it will sooner or later have to do with discouragement. It's almost like a law, almost like gravity. So everything must stay the way it is. If someone gets up and says, no, wait, that's not okay the way it is, it's like everyone secretly banded together, and if your head sticks out above the crowd, he gets for real. These dynamics exist. And it's not so tragic. You just need to know how to deal with it. Because actually, with the kingdom of God, when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, he talks about a confrontation. So he says, you're the light of the world. That means all around the light there's darkness. He says, a little sourdough is mixed among the flour. That means the trough of flour is somehow different than the sourdough. So there's a confrontation, there's a conflict. And you need to know one thing very clear. I say this to all the sensitive people among you. The more emotionally sensitive you are, the more you are receptive for this. And the problem is that we sometimes think that simply picking up on dynamics, that this is somehow very spiritual or even prophetic, but that's not the case, not true. If you have a strong antenna, it's a curse and a blessing at the same time, but it's all the more important to learn how to overcome. Knowing how to pick up things is indeed very good. It's much better than when people don't get at all what's going on. But to just get what's going on isn't enough. Really, there's people who pick up on so much that they are always depressed. Because there's a bad mood, and there's this in the world, and there's so much fear and a bad atmosphere in town. Yeah, I know, but that's what we call world. You know, but we are actually in this situation of a fight, and your surroundings will always potentially be discouraging. So there's always that your surroundings won't exactly jump at you with courage. Yes, and great, but somehow the kingdom of God spreads from the inside out. That doesn't mean you can pluck it, because it already grows everywhere. Sometimes we expect to sense it everywhere already, but it's up to us to say like Nehemiah, wait, the walls are destroyed, that shouldn't be. Come, let's renovate them, let's build up the city. But then he has to learn how to deal with the opposition that comes, and we will look at that more next. You must know these opponents and attacks will come. And I have more bad news for you. They will get bigger in proportion to your growing calling. Yeah? It's like in a computer game. The bad guys get bigger at each level, but you also get bigger guns. That's how the game works and how it is in life too. We grow. Really, you can look at the level of resistance you're getting and find out how important your situation is that you're in. And retreat isn't an option. The only option is to learn, how can I stand firm? How can I grow? The wonderful thing is, Nehemiah, he really has a commission from his king. And all the critics and people who come crawling from their dens, they really can't do much about it. They can only talk. And the same is true for us. The mandate you carry from God is actually invincible. And the fight isn't about will the wall be built or not. That's already clear. It's the king's edict for it to happen. The only question is, what will you believe? Will you get distracted? Will you let them enrage you? Really, it's only about your head and what you believe in. The real battle isn't about the stuff, because that's already secure. That's a very interesting statement. By the way, same goes for the entry of God's people, the Israelites, to the Promised Land. Don't forget, they didn't actually need 40 years to walk from Egypt to Israel. You would have to walk very slowly, because it's not that far. They only needed like 1 year or so to the most. And the rest of those years, they had to take detours. Because, do you know why? Here it doesn't say the correct Bible verse. It should be Numbers 32, verse 9. In Numbers 32, verse 9, it says, "They went up to the valley of Eshcol. They had seen the land, and then had taken Israel's courage, so that they no longer wanted to enter the land which the Lord had destined for them." It's talking about the messengers. So they sent messengers to the land, and they come back saying, "The land is great, but man, there are so many giants there, crazy stuff." But it robs the people of courage, and not directly, so they don't want to take the land. But the fight is only about their thinking. Suddenly they lose courage. Imagine that. Could it be that there are areas in your life, in my life, lands where God says, "I have this for you," but we somehow lose faith on the way to go there because something happens to us and it's in our minds? Not with God's mandate. That stayed exactly the same. Okay. I hope you're now motivated to look closely. How does discouragement work and how do we overcome it? I hear a clear yes. Okay, thank you. Very encouraging. So this represents a kind of a speech bubble. There's basically 4 strategies how this goes. And we can look at it in the life of Nehemiah. Namely, right at the beginning. The first thing that comes, the whole group we already saw, the first thing is, what is this thing he's doing there? What's the point? Do you want to rebel against the king? To be offensive? This is funny, he's even acting on behalf of the king. But at first there's a false assumption. First they say, you must be doing this based on false motives. The first strategy of discouragement is to imply false motives. So, imply false motives. And that could, for example, be this great idea you have, this new idea you want to start on. You must only be doing this because you think you're better than us. You only want to make yourself higher. You're just always complaining. Or you're just being a proud person. Little question, who might this voice come from? Okay, so who might it be? Who could say such things? Okay, it could come from other people, it could come directly from the enemy, the devil, and it could also come from ourselves.
And you know what? The source doesn't matter. The result is the same. So often we don't even need others or the devil to be discouraged. We do it ourselves. So these voices could be in us, like an inner commentator. He's watching you and says, "Stop pretending to be so pious. You're only doing this for blah, blah, blah." And he talks everything down. Sound familiar? We often do this ourselves. There's an inner voice, an inner commentator. And then, of course, there's other people who do this to us too. And sometimes it's even from the enemy. One of the best stories I know about implying false motives is from the Middle Ages, from a very famous preacher and saint named Bernard of Clairvaux. He led great missions to the people in the Middle Ages and is the founder of the Cistercian order of monks. And it is said that he could preach so well that the masses lay at his feet. And many miracles took place because of his preaching. I think people tried to make him pope twice, but he refused each time, so he was highly influential and would preach one time and everyone would be at his feet. And one time he heard a voice say, "Bernard, preach a little longer, then they will make you their king." Then he heard another voice say, "Bernard, stop preaching. You're only preaching out of pride." So he wondered what he should do. Should he keep preaching or not? Wouldn't it be more humble to stop? And he turned around, so the story goes, and he said, "Devil, I didn't start because of you, nor will I finish because of you." Both voices were from an evil source. Both were accusing him of false motives. Look, if you start trying to distill your motives into all eternity, you will never start anything. If we were to say that you start something new, but what if there's a little pride? Then you must say, "Of course, I'm a human." Every human has a little pride in them. The only thing you can do is to turn your eyes back to the Lord. But to imply false motives in itself is already a strategy of discouragement, because you will never find the end of it. Let's move on. So, Nehemiah stands firm, and then the story continues. And as the enemies hear that there's first progress with the wall, they really get mad and say to each other, "What are these miserable Jews doing? Do they want to fortify the city again? Or make sacrifices? Are they trying to finish in a day? Could they take the stones that were ruined by fire and give them new life?" And Tobias the Ammonite, a real scoffer who stands next to him, says, "Let them build. If a fox jumps on their wall, it will come falling down." Just great. I mean, would you look at these expressions closely? I mean, that's terrific. Like those miserable Jews. And it's so easy, the stones are burnt. If they were to finish in a day and a fox jumped on it, it would all fall down. It means the voice of discouragement says, "You're ridiculous." Who do you think you are? You're a nobody. That's, by the way, the same voice Elijah fell for when he says, "I'm no better than my forefathers." You know what? It's probably true. He probably wasn't better than his forefathers, but that's not the point. The Lord had called him. He could say, "I'm no better than my forefathers," but still the Lord called me. Wow! And now he does great things for me. But somewhere along the way, he started to believe this thing of, "You're just a nothing. Just look at you." And do you, my friend, know this voice? Who do you think you are? You're just Mr. Ding Dong from the east part of the middle of nowhere somewhere. And you think you're something special? You didn't even go to school for that. And you ain't got it. Look at yourself. And look at the other people. They are so much better. And you're just a stupid nobody. What do those miserable Jews want? And you're a nobody. And that also means whatever you do is meaningless. At a later point, Nehemiah answers in an impressive way. He says, "I can't come talk right now. I'm busy building something great." So talking down who you are and what you are doing is a typical strategy of discouragement. See, the truth is, all great things start small.
Everything that becomes great starts super simple. And there are 1,000 reasons to look down on something that looks small, to say it will never be anything. But everything that's big was once small. It's important to learn not to fall for that. Next strategy of discouragement, this one's not so easy to spot. Namely, as the enemies of Nehemiah realize they can't stop him from his work so easily, they pick up another strategy. Namely, then Sanballat and Geshem said to me, "Come, we want to meet in Kipharim, in the valley of Ono." But they had evil intentions against me. I sent messengers to them with the reply, "I'm working on a great work, so I can't come." I think that's great, because they even sent the messengers 3 times to him. It's already a bad sign if someone says, "We're meeting in the valley of Ono." That's already concerning, but it's interesting. They just want to get him to stop building. And now they say, "Hey, let's talk from man to man, let's make a deal, let's talk business. These are the big guys who have money, let's talk," and so on. And they even send the messenger 3 times, and each time he answers, "No, I can't, because I'm building this great work." So good he's building this wall that is still small at the time. He calls it a great work. Friends, there's a strategy of discouragement that is hard to detect because it looks so harmless, and it's called distraction. And I'm not talking about the normal distractions we always have. Instead, if you're honest, sometimes you know what the right thing is, but it also feels a little scary. And then you run to the second best choice, like going to the Valley of Ono and sitting around with people in a circle or some leadership meeting, and let's talk. I want to say something about that. I know this from experience. If you really have a vision and a calling from the Lord, as soon as you start doing it, you will get 1,000 other offers. How about you do something else? No, can't you do something else? Why don't we get together and talk? Sure, we can meet and talk. And at the end, the idea is, do something a little more harmless, but don't build that wall. Come, do something else. And it's just a strategy of pulling you away from what is really important. It just looks more harmless, so we don't immediately catch on. The problem is, if you give room to discouragement, you will take increasingly big detours. That's what would happen if we went to the Valley of Ono. We would talk to them for 3 years and the wall still wouldn't be built. What we've seen earlier with the Promised Land, the result of letting themselves be discouraged is they went in circles for 38 years. Seriously, there are people, even ministries and churches, all the things who heard what God had said, but they don't do it because of discouragement or fear. So they run around in circles for 38 years. And the Lord is so merciful that He sends chance after chance and messenger after messenger. But in these are distractions. Distractions from what would really be the next step, what would be the true vision, the actual right thing.
Have you noticed there are no ads on this channel? This is the only one. There's one reason for that. This channel is funded by donations only. If you want to help us to continue with this work, you find everything about supporting us below in the description. Now enjoy the rest of the video.
The last discouragement strategy I would like to share with you is fascinating and hard to see through. Namely, there are friends of Nehemiah, and they warn him now. They say, "Let us go to the house of God, the inside of the temple, and shut the doors of the temple, for they will come to kill you." I replied, "Should a man like me run away? Who of my fellow men would stay alive if they entered the temple? I will not go in." At first, the idea to go into the temple and hide yourself there sounds spiritual. But actually, it's we are retreating. And you have to see how that sounds. They are saying, "For they will come to kill you." Someone will come. In the night they will come. Of course at night. And in a new moon or whatever, they will brutally murder you or something. And really, this voice wants to get Nehemiah to go hide in what seems safe. I call this strategy introversion. You might know the term extroverted. That means turn towards the outside. And introverted means look inward, hide in your own little safe space, barricade yourself, dig in. Friends, the interesting thing is that can look spiritual. It looks pious. We will take 4 years of sabbatical and go into the temple and lick our wounds. Don't get me wrong, there are times to hide yourself in the Lord. There are times to settle down and just sit with God and come to rest. I'll talk about that later. But there is something that looks remarkably similar but is different. And that's introversion, pulling back because of discouragement. And the problem is we aren't actually safe in our hideout. That's even true in a literal war. Someone once found out that the armor Paul talks about includes a breastplate, helmet, belt, shoes, and a shield. The only thing it doesn't include is a backplate. If you run away, you aren't protected. There are many people who think, if I follow the Lord with fiery energy, if I really do this in a radically full way, that's dangerous. And so I'd rather lay low a little. I'll retreat a little and be safe that way. But that's a foolish error. You're not made to run away. Again, to get help a few weeks, or get prayer, get healing, that's great. But the lifestyle of introversion, just be careful, is not what God has for you. That's a result of discouragement. It's these voices that come, okay, I'll not risk anything anymore. Got burned once, now I'll play it safe. If you burned your fingers once, then you need to process that with God and ideally with friends to pray and become healed in that point. But then get back in the race. In introversion, you aren't safe. Nehemiah says, how can I stay alive if I hide? That might sound nice to hide away. It might even feel spiritual. Now I'll only pray and do nothing else. No, you are called to follow your calling, to not run away, because that's not safe. I want to add a little side note about people who discourage others. Just for those of you who tried something new and then were criticized for it. If you look who these characters are and where their resistance comes from, you see it, by the way, also in the book of Ezra. It takes place in a similar time period. We read that these Samaritans who resist and complain about rebuilding Jerusalem, and Samaritans are northern tribes of Israel, the people who live in compromise. They have mixed with other nations and also started worshipping other gods. And they have a problem with this. The Samaritans were actually God's people and had the same calling. You know what? If you faithfully follow your calling, those people will hate you who have the same calling but didn't remain faithful. There's not much you can do. You can only pray for them and meet them with a mild heart. It's not about judging them. Oh, you Samaritan. That's not the point. But if you follow through, if you are faithful, you trigger something in people who have a calling and deep down know it. So they will secretly hate you because you are a living accusation. And here it comes. The Lord trusts you to handle it. David had to serve at a court of Saul. He was a totally awful king who had a call to be a good king, but then was unfaithful. So he hated David. But the Lord allows that David becomes great under Saul. That's part of the school. But it's still important to know it's not always because you did something wrong or because those people are evil, but it's natural dynamics that develop when we become unfaithful to our calling. So now we've seen what discouragement is and what it looks like. The real rough part of discouragement is it's contagious. It can spread to others. So you might find that whole families or friend groups, churches, companies, or even nations can be influenced by a blanket of depression, of discouragement. We read that in an interesting passage in Deuteronomy, the 5th book of Moses. They had the leaders of enlistment, people who are responsible for which Israelites fight. These list leaders are supposed to say to the national soldiers, if there is anyone among you who is afraid and has no courage, they should walk out and return home, so that the other brothers will not be robbed of their courage. You have to let that sink in. God says here, I can't allow my people to fight without having courage. Friends, this is a high value. To say no to discouragement. It's not the culture or mindset or climate of the kingdom of God to be so scared and depressed and wanting to retreat. God says, you know what? I would rather fight with less people than with those who have no courage. Not with those who are without courage. By the way, I don't mean hesitant people here. There are people whose gift it is to see weaknesses, critical thinkers. That's a big gift. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean a spirit of despair, incapable to take a step of faith. That isn't good, it's dangerous. The tragic part is discouragement is contagious. But discouraged people often look for other discouraged friends. Have you ever noticed that? Depressed people like to hang out with other depressed people and it spreads. But you need to be careful in what you say. Words have power in what spirit they spread, in an organization, a church, a community, a family. It's paralyzing when a spirit of discouragement, of defeatism is present. You can imagine. Imagine you're supposed to shoot a penalty kick. Or you're a soccer player and you start saying to everyone, it won't work, the game is already over, it's done. And if you spread such a mood, that's miserable, it's deadly. You won't keep your job much longer. It's important whether we walk by faith and if we learn to say no to discouragement. That's why I hope you are encouraged to now learn how to say no, how to get out of this number, because it will hit you again and again. It's not just something you exit from one day to another, but we need to learn how to fight. We must learn how to resist. We learned this in Nehemiah as well. By the way, you can read this book at home. It's quite a story and not that long. And it's a great instruction on leadership. The first thing Nehemiah teaches us is, let me show you in chapter 4. It continues. I'll read a few parts before this comes. As Sanballat and Tobias, as well as the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the reconstruction of the wall of Jerusalem was progressing, they became angry and banded together to go to war against Jerusalem and to cause unrest there. But we prayed to God and set up guards day and night. But then the Jews said, the carriers are losing strength. There's too much rubble. We will never be able to rebuild the wall. Okay, discouragement. Now, but our enemies said they should not notice us or see us until we are in the middle amongst them. Then we'll strike them down and destroy this whole endeavor. But the Jews who lived with them came and said to us at least 10 times, from all areas where they live, they are approaching against us. And here comes chapter 4, verse 7. Then I placed the people below the wall on open ground, sorted according to clans, armed with swords, lances, and bows, and I mustered them. Then I stood up and said, do not fear them, think of the Lord. He is great and awesome. Fight for your brothers and sons, for your daughters and women and your houses. Interesting response. Our enemies found out that their plan had become known. So God foiled their plan, and we all returned to the wall, each to their work. What's happening here is interesting, because there's rumors coming from all sides. They're coming, they will come here. And then the others come and say, you know, the carriers are losing their strength, it's too much trouble, we can't do it. Interesting what Nehemiah does next. He says, everyone position yourself on the edge of the wall, everywhere where it's not finished yet, and fight. So he's shifting the focus of the people away from we're doing so bad, we're poor and stuck in the city, out towards the enemy. He even calls him by name. He says, here is the real enemy we need to be fighting. The interesting thing is we read, right when our enemies found out that their plan had become known to us and so on, the plot was already over. There was no fight. So the moment when the people realize there's a problem and resistance is fading, the main battle is already won. And that, friends, goes for discouragement in general. The first key step is to call the enemy by name, not flirt with it, not pretend it's all normal, not lick your wounds, but call the enemy by name. And the enemy, of course, is discouragement. Call the enemy by name. Discouragement makes it that you sit under a tree and say, I'm no better than my forefathers. I want to die. Everything is awful and nobody is left. Nehemiah's focus is this. Wait a minute. Something's wrong here. Now it's time to fight. And when you're confronted with discouragement, it's not enough to wait for better times or cry yourself out with a friend. You need to take stance in the Spirit and say, to here and no further, this isn't good. This is an enemy. I'm not made to think this way. And my friend, this step has to come from you. It's the first step. It's only in step 2 where you do what you might be thinking of. Step 2 is, we read, think of the Lord. He is great and mighty. In between the attacks, again and again and again, Nehemiah calls to God and says, but you, Lord, will not hand us over to shame. The second step is to flee into worship. Worship. Important, this isn't about running into a begging prayer. You know, there's also begging prayers. Dear God, this is so bad, and I don't know anymore what to do, and so on. But worship takes a position of faith. That's interesting. Look here at the passage. It's the same thing again, where he won't go into the temple to lock himself inside. He says, for who of my kin would survive if they went into the temple? I will not go in. And then I realized that, or you could say, I recognized clearly that God had not sent him. Rather, he had spoken these prophecies over me because Tobias and Sanballat had pressured him. He was pressured so that I would act in fear and be led to sin. He was pressured. A great verb. He was pressured. You know what just happened? This, I saw through his plans, only comes after he decided to not give room to fear. Very important. He decides first, I won't run away. There's an enemy to fight and I'll face him. The Lord is greater. Worship.
First he makes that choice, and then he says, then I saw through the plans that it was a trick. If you're still in the mode of fear and walking in discouragement, you don't see clearly. When you are afraid, don't believe a word your mind says. Don't believe a word from your mind when you're afraid. I don't mean that you shouldn't put two and two together. But if you notice that you're incapable of seeing spiritually, you first need to make a choice. First say, wait a minute. These are voices of discouragement. That's not good. I need to resist that. I need to worship the Lord until He is bigger in my mind than that problem. And then I can see clearly again. Same goes for Elijah, by the way. Elijah had to get out of his swamp. Very interesting. God evidently allows him to run away, but then He tells him, you're sitting somewhere on a desert, in a cave. You're totally discouraged and want to die. That's where the wonderful part with the thunder and fire and such comes in. But then God tells him, come out and stand before the cave, and He leads Elijah out of the cave and meets him in a new way. With a gentle whisper, and suddenly perspective comes back. That's so interesting what God tells Elijah. You can read it at home. First, Elijah starts complaining. Elijah starts complaining and says, I worked for the Lord and I'm the last one standing. And God says to him, okay, I left 7,000 people who didn't bend their knee before the Baal. So basically that's not true that you are all alone. Your perspective is twisted right now. And also, I have a new job for you. You are going to anoint a new prophet and anoint so-and-so as the new king. So in this new encounter with God, there is also new perspective. And that is the third and most important point. Actually, the most important point of all. You need a new encounter with God. A new encounter with God. I say this as point 3 because if the first 2 points aren't there yet, then you won't come up with the idea. But in the end, friends, you know where you find creativity and courage? With the one who is creativity and courage in fullness. All is in His presence, with Him. And if you are running empty or only functioning, maybe even in the name of the Lord, like Elijah, He's doing a good thing by leading the people back to God. But he gets hit by the arrow of discouragement so badly, you can assume that he clearly wasn't so close to God anymore. Because we humans are made so, we only work properly when we are close to Jesus. John 15, remain in me and you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. You're not created to be separated from God for a long time. And in the end, these 2 points are still important to first shake off discouragement, but then what you need in order to get new perspective, vision, and courage is you need Jesus. You need to look for Him in prayer. And sometimes that requires a change of scenery. Elijah needs to change locations, and sometimes it's really good to go someplace else to seek God in a different way, to meet God. You can't do that every day. But if you really are discouraged in a deep way, you need to get out of things and say, Lord, I need to hear from you in a new way. I need to hear anew what is my calling, because all my strength is in His voice. In this godly mandate, which Nehemiah has, lies all his strength. He has a paper from the king, I'm allowed to build the wall, and then it's invincible. You also have that mandate, but sometimes we need to hear it afresh. Sometimes you need to go back to the Lord and say, Lord, tell me again, why am I doing all this? And in the end, my friend, the power that motivates us all is His presence. So if you do something in the world, in politics, economics, or the church, hoping to get something back, so letting people reward you for it, then you are destined for frustration. Just go book your therapy appointment now, because you will never get back as much as you invest. Never. In the end, God says once to Abraham, Genesis 15, I myself am your great reward. Or you could translate, I myself am your overly large reward. Yeah, really, who are you doing all this for? Either you do this for the Lord, or the danger is great that you will be very, very disappointed. And then it's also okay because then the Lord will use this disappointment to get closer to you in a deep way. But in a final sense, this presence is the place where you find encouragement and all perspective, all energy, all vision. It all comes from His presence. A new encounter with Him. Finally, it's also interesting with Nehemiah that he doesn't just say, hey, everyone should fight the enemy now, but he lets them blow the horns. And he says, when you hear the horn blast, stand together around us. God will fight for us. What I find interesting is that gathering together is clearly important here. It's also important in sports, fighting as a team. In war, it's important not to fight alone. And in every fight you are in, it's important to not fight alone. Do not fight alone. That's the worrying part about Elijah. He thinks he's the only one left. And there are many people who believe that. They think it's only us. Us three are left. Just Jockel, Eddie, and I. Us three. And really, Jockel and Eddie are sort of half done. It's really just me. Yeah, many people believe that. Actually, there's nobody left. And of the three of us, the other two hardly ever show up. And they show up late and leave too early. And so this attitude of actually we're the last one remaining is surprisingly common. I even catch myself thinking this way sometimes. And really what that does, you make God small. You make God small. For the Lord, it's no problem to say, I have 7,000 people you know nothing about, they're still hiding. But even on a small scale, friends, there are topics you cannot walk through alone. You need to know that. U2 sings it well, sometimes you can't make it on your own. There's a lot in spiritual life you have to go through alone, but also things you can't do alone. But where you need two people who come pray for you and to whom you say, friends, I have a problem here. Here, sound the horn and come here. And especially this topic of discouragement will show you that you can't do it alone. Then you need people to come over who pray for you. People who speak to this thing for a few minutes and say, this way of thinking needs to leave right now. People who have faith for you. As Moses' arms got weak, he had two people who held his arms up high. Sometimes we need people to use their faith muscles when your own faith muscle is too weak. Sometimes that's needed. And especially when it comes to discouragement, you can't make it out alone. Finally, what Elijah says got me thinking. Namely, he says literally to God, the first thing he says to God as he meets him in the desert, he says, I have been zealous for you. In Hebrew, it's an interesting phrase, zealously, I have been zealous for you. It's like he's complaining. He says, I've given so much and now they want to kill me, and I'm the last one that's left. I have an interesting question for you. See, you probably know that he had the 400 priests of Baal killed. Do you know he never was actually told by God to do that? I don't have a theory about what that means, but could it be that Elijah in his zeal actually went too far? This zealously I have been zealous for God. All I know is we sometimes are too zealous. Francis Frangipane, a great author, he once wrote a sentence I would like to read to you. He says, zeal without wisdom will eventually become an idol. It forces us to expect what is unrealistic and to stand outside the time and anointing of God. Again, zeal without wisdom. So I want to give everything and will do 110%, and I mean it well, and I give it all I got.
Without wisdom, without this element of listening for God's timing and structure and go. He says zeal without wisdom will eventually become an idol. It forces us to expect what is unrealistic and to stand outside the timing and anointing of God. And the last question I have in dealing with discouragement is a critical question to self-reflect. Have I tried too hard? Too zealous? Sometimes it's not just some evil enemy, but sometimes we get ourselves in these kinds of messes. See, God gives you a range of things you should do, but He also gives a provision and protection and anointing. But when we are moving outside of this place, we don't have the same level of protection, provision, and anointing. And so if I walk out of that and realize, wow, I'm totally discouraged, I need to ask myself, are there areas where I was zealous beyond what God actually had for me? And I think with Elijah, this might have been the case. So, no to discouragement. We are to learn that, a fight that is given to us. Here's 5 steps how you can specifically learn that to say no to discouragement. The promise is incredibly large and it's so important. See how strongly the author of the book of Hebrews urges us to take seriously the topic of resistance and endurance. He writes, "Don't throw away your assurance, which brings with it great reward. What you need is endurance so you can do the will of God and thus obtain the promise." The disadvantage, friends, is, do you know where endurance comes from? For example, in sports? Exactly, through training. Training beyond what feels comfortable. If you only ever run as far as or do as many push-ups as you feel comfortable with, your endurance won't grow. So muscle growth happens when muscle fibers tear. Pain and going to the limits. Endurance comes through resistance, and God actually allows for this resistance because He wants this for us, that we get the promised reward. It's so beautiful. Don't throw away your assurance that brings great reward with it. What you need is endurance. That's interesting. Who doesn't want to do God's will and get the promised prize? He says, "Yes, I will do your will, and I will have all you want for me." And He says, it's a prerequisite endurance. Here it says, what you need is endurance. Jesus says, "These things I've said to you that you would have peace in me. In the world you have fears, or in the world you are pressed, but take courage, I have overcome the world." Jesus announces that we will have troubles in the world. He says there will be discouragement. There will be all these things, even conscious attacks. Not just against your body. You not only need to care for your body and your soul, there is also attacks on your ability to hear from God, to take on a spiritual perspective. These spiritual attacks try to rob you of your perspective and the memory of past successes. And that goes for anyone who sees the status quo and wants to change it. That's why you need to learn to call the enemy by name, not flirt with it or rest on it. Not to say, "That's just who I am, that's my genes, and my 18 friends think the same way." Instead, take a stance to flee into worship, not just lamenting prayer, but step into a prayer that proclaims God is greater than all that. And finally, to stretch out to a new encounter with God. He is the source of all power and all energy, and also not to fight alone. Seek out help with others when you need it. And keep asking yourself, if I'm so vulnerable right after a great high, a great success, where might I have crossed some boundaries on the inside? Or even physically, where you're exhausted, haven't slept enough. Body, spirit, soul, they are one. Or are you emotionally not well because something happened in a relationship that wasn't good? And these are the typical moments where fiery arrows want to hit you, and where you can learn to get up victoriously and say no to discouragement.